Hey everyone, welcome to the Balanced Lens, where we examine faith, culture, and politics from a balanced perspective. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that is important in American politics, and we want to cut through the noise into one of the country's most pressing issues. And so, we're tackling this topic on why is the country so fiercely divided on politics? As a Christian, we are commanded to love one another, but when people hold extreme views or when people are polarized, how do we extend compassion? How do we extend love? How do we understand someone that's coming from a different side of the aisle with a different perspective? And so, diving deep into this topic, we're going to ask ourselves this question: what exactly is polarization? How do we define it in terms of what we see in the world today?
When we talk about polarization, we're not just simply talking about disagreements. We're talking about people coalescing around identity, ideology, even emotion, and then suddenly creating camps that are in opposition to each other, right? And the more farther away you are, the more polarized you are. Scholars like to make a distinction between the two basic types of polarization. One would be the classic ideological polarization. So we may have disagreements in terms of taxation, immigration, climate change, and that's okay. It's okay to have disagreements and good debates on that. You can see how Congress votes based on the representatives we vote and sent into both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Interestingly, in spite of people thinking that there's so much ideological polarization, there's a lot of research that says, according to Pew Research, that it isn't as divided as you would think from an ideological perspective. The second type of polarization is called like an affective polarization. Now that's the dangerous one, where people don't just simply disagree. They actually dislike their opposition. They distrust the opposition. And then what happens is, so you start talking about, it starts off as like, okay, you're misguided. Then you move to a level where you're saying, no, that's an immoral position. Then you start saying, position is a danger to our nation. So it starts escalating the rhetoric, and it becomes, and the politics become very hard. So like, because now you're talking about an existential threat, there is a big threat happening. And this is why you would see, especially in the last 10 years or so, many people have lost friendships over the other person's political position. And like I said, it's interesting how, according to Pew Research at least, if they track this, and they say that there is data that shows that both of these types of polarization have consistently gone up in the last 30, 35, 40 years. In Congress, for example, Democrats and Republicans are far apart ideologically than they've ever been in the last 50 years. As a matter of fact, take some time and watch some of the older videos of senators talking from different aisles, and you'll be like, wait, are you a Democrat then? Because you sound like a Republican. Or were you a Republican? It's confusing, like when you hear some people talk that they were actually a Democrat or a Republican. So the divide has definitely gone up among the public. For example, the affective polarization, the dangerous one, has gone up dramatically. Like 72% of Republicans in 2022, for example, and 63% of Democrats viewed the opposite party as more than other Americans, which is dramatically different from this 2016. So this is where we have to view polarizations with more nuance, and I know we're going to get in the rest of the questions, but this is what we mean when we say that the country is more polarized today than it was before.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, we've all lost friends. We've all lost family members, or at least we've had division with friends and family members over issues like this. Not intentionally, but unfortunately, sometimes we are holding on to a position. And now, as you mentioned, it escalates into affective polarization. I hate you because you hold XYZ position. Because you hold XYZ position, you are immoral. How can you believe that position? You must not be a good person, right? That's affective polarization. And the trends show this, like Pew Research, you can go research this. We just went over some of these facts, but over the last 30, 40 years, there is consistent data that shows that we are more polarized. So if someone says to you, well, this was how it was 30, 40 years ago, people were divided, partially true, but it is much more divided now than it ever has been in America. Important topic when we're trying to understand subcultures within America or different communities and how they interact with one another and why we hold such different views. One of the first things we're going to look at is traditional media. We have our big outlets, our Foxes, our CNNs, our MSNBCs. How do they play a role in all of this polarization?
So a lot of people do openly blame the media. Of course, I think President Trump has brought it to the forefront with his quotes about fake news and stuff. So we have a lot more people distrusting it, but you could argue it's for good reason. So if you look at the history, so we had, these big news organizations, whether they're CNN, Fox, New York Times, etc., etc. First of all, like if you think, I know a lot of younger audience may not remember, but in the 70s, early 90s, we had very limited news channels, and there was very strong editorial standards that had to be met before they would release that information to people. It was slower in terms of how fast it came, and it was more curated, right? So it basically then became like a thing where people would trust institutions. In my younger days, we used to always listen to the top of the hour news. It was like for 5 minutes and you got the whole news and you were done. It was nuggets, it was vetted, you could trust it and you would move on. But now, right, you fast forward even to this traditional media, cable news and talk show, they've injected a lot of opinion driven programming. And what you see is that the financial incentives have shifted, and it rewards outrage, emotional um emotional engagements. Like they want to retain their audience, so they keep emphasizing things that are more and more catered to their audience. It's less about reporting the news in an unbiased and neutral manner and more about providing your opinion of how outrageous something is or is not. And so that shift is very clear. And one of the interesting things that I found when I was researching is we used to rely a lot more on local news in the past. And slowly but surely, national coverage and news have taken over. And this is an important note because when you relied more on local news always tends to happen around you in your community and therefore is more pragmatic to your day-to-day living. National news is not as pragmatic, it's more ideological in the way you connect to it. So the silent decline of local news and our dependence on it has also caused the traditional media to lose its footing.
Yeah, excellent points. And it's not just traditional media. In the last 15 years, we have social media that plays a huge role in polarization. Social media, you can compare it to being like the new kid on the block that's pouring gasoline on the fire. Um, Platforms like Facebook, Twitter or X, TikTok, and this, they use algorithms designed to maximize engagement, right? Likes, shares, rage clicks. Seeing something that's so extreme but conforms to your views, now you're suddenly enraged and want to see more of that content. And all of this is like quicksand, whether it's traditional media or social media. You take a step in and sometimes you don't realize you're being sucked in, right? Sadly, we see that with friendships. We see that with family members. They watch XYZ news source, and that's the only thing they watch. And suddenly, it's like, what happened to you? Like you're almost become indoctrinated by XYZ side, and you can't even talk to you anymore. And so, the reward for all this, for a social media outlet, for a traditional outlet, is that they present you outraged. They present you extreme content because guess what? It keeps you scrolling. It keeps you watching. As a result, there's these echo chambers. You're fed more of what you already like, and cross-cutting views really get buried. What's interesting in 2023, Facebook had a study, or actually an experiment, Facebook and Instagram during the 2020 election, where they rolled out something called chronological feeds. And the idea is let's move away from the algorithm and let's give everyone chronological feeds. Meaning, let's just give them what appears on your timeline without any special type of algorithm directing content. Interestingly enough, studies show that this did not reduce polarization much, but it did cut time on platform and exposure to uncivil extreme views. So algorithms do amplify like-minded sources. Over half of what an average user sees aligns with their politics. It just feels good, right? Like you don't want to be questioned. And self-selection obviously matters too. Partisan people want to follow extremes, right? Platforms make it worse because they filter bubbles and viral misinformation and they present that to you. TikTok experiments have showed radicalization in hours, right? It's not just the sole villain, it's, cable news, it's everything together that really creates this tunnel that you kind of get stuck in. And social media really makes this division feel personal and even more constant than does a traditional media outlet. But if you get psychological, here's what it gets interesting. We're going to go from traditional media, social media, and think through how this affects our psyche. There's something called cognitive dissonance. It's a uncomfortable mental itch when your beliefs clash with reality or your actions. Leon Fessinger's classic theory, he says that we essentially hate what causes us to itch. Cognitive dissonance is interesting. When your views are challenged, your heart rate literally starts to go up. You get uncomfortable. There's displeasure. And so, how do you react to cognitive dissonance? Often by doubling down on your original view instead of changing it. In politics, this fuels polarization. And so, if you hear about a candidate that you love, right, and it turns out this person is flawed or has a lot of weaknesses that you never knew about, cognitive dissonance kicks in. Supporters of that candidate start to rationalize, well, those actions weren't that bad. And they rationalize that more than non supporters do. It happens even across parties. Post 2020 or 2024, you'll see supporters of any candidate kind of rewriting facts to reduce discomfort. And so this entrenches division instead of updating our beliefs with new info or having the humility to say, maybe I'm wrong about this. Right? Cognitive dissonance kicks in. It causes us to twist information, new information to fit into our schema. And so why facts alone don't change our mind is because of cognitive dissonance. It makes us really defensive and causes us to um, really stay in our echo chamber.
It's very true. And it's something that, so the key over here is, and the reason why we are saying this is to be self aware. The most self aware you are, that what you're walking into, if you realize as you walk into the social media space that there's a chance that I'm only listening to what I like to listen to, as long as you know that, I think I feel okay with that. But
Right.
it's a lack of that understanding and knowledge that is scary, right? When you walk in
Right.
and you don't realize that, that's when you could be influenced in a way that you would not appreciate. So that's the thing that I want our audience and listeners to think through. It's like, be aware of what is out there, be aware of the incentives that the people you listen to have when they are purporting whatever information they're saying, so that you then can calibrate and think through like how should you be thinking about this matter at hand.
Yeah, and it's so true. Like people are literally monetizing on your views, on your clicks, right? You read it and you think, oh, wow, this is all factual. But reality is there's a profit motive behind whatever content provider is displaying this content to you. And so it's important to walk in with that realization and realize this isn't just purely factual. And there's often more to the story than you're reading there. But it goes back to the question of like personal responsibility. Have we as a society lost critical thinking skills? Isn't it our responsibility to decipher this stuff, or is this the media's job?
And the way, before I dive into like details, think about, especially parents can probably relate to what I'm about to say. So we always want to protect our children. And we are aware that there is a balance between giving them some exposure to reality, but doing it in the right time when they're mature enough to be able to react to that, right? So that's why, for instance, in Australia, they've passed a law against social media for kids below, I believe it was 16. So why do we do that? Because we are trying to understand when is the right time for somebody to be able, how can they critically think through the circumstances they are in and make a good decision, right? We think through this for our children, and we are careful with what they're exposed to, whether it's on TV or it's books or the type of schools we send to. We need to have the same attitude with every piece of information we consume. It's called critical thinking, but it doesn't hurt really to be a little cynical in your thinking, right? Understand what the other party is trying to do and how it helps them. And do they have an incentive to be on the side they're doing whether it's type of their audience or their subscribers or whatever it is, right? Try to understand what is probably motivating them, just like you would go in a business deal and start negotiating. You need to understand what the other side is trying to sell and why in order to be able to negotiate a good deal, right? So it's the same kind of thinking. And that's where critical thinking comes into play, right? Critically analyzing the situation is something that is very important in today's age where the information is so overwhelming that it's easier to just pick something and run with it, right? But that is worse than not picking a side. The best thing you can do when somebody asks you something or you are encountered with any piece of information or any piece of quote unquote fact, whether it's from CNN or Fox or MSNBC or Reuters, it doesn't matter where it is from, is to look at it neutrally and be like, prove it to me, right? Like you have to be able to critically think and say, I will not believe it unless you prove it to me. So do not be overwhelmed by that cognitive overload of information that comes in and tries to sweep you out of your feet. Also be wary of your mind is programmed to take quick shortcuts to get a conclusion. Be aware of that, right? Because when there's so much information, remember, our mind is so good at finding patterns and running with it. But you can't blame the mind because it can only make the decision based on the information you're feeding it. So it absorbs the information based on whatever clicks and likes and whatever you've done, and then it creates a pattern. So it's not your mind's fault. It's your fault of what information you're feeding it. That's why it's important to understand, like, and I've said this before, my morning goes like this. I go to Reuters, AP News, Fox News, CNN, Al Jazeera, Al Monitor if I need, and then Indian news like this, NDTV. I go through probably 8, 9, 10 news channels, like big news channels, just to triangulate what is actually the news of the day and what different perspectives are saying. Also understand that there are some inherent biases in us, which is we have some preference of what we would like things to look like. So sometimes what we do is we take in information that allows us to reach the conclusion that we want, whatever it is. It doesn't matter what it is. So imagine if there's, let's get off politics and go to religion. An atheist looks at information one way versus a theist because you come from it with a particular worldview, which is filtering the information to see in one way versus another. One of the cool things research shows us that the more educated, intelligent you are, it can actually increase your bias, not reduce your bias, because you're more inclined to find data to support your views than being honest and humble and trying to find the truth. And that is the key, right? And already we know that we have already said that we don't trust our traditional institutions for fact, whether it's the government or the news, right? So, okay, if you can't trust them, where are you getting your information from? Facebook? From Twitter? Right? So that is one of the problems that we have, right? And then we have this need that we want to get to a conclusion quickly. More and more what I've seen over time is people have lost patience. They do not want to deliberate whether it's with others or themselves. So what happens is you want to come to a conclusion. For example, the Iran war that is happening. Are we winning or not? Well, can you sit on that question for a few days before coming to the conclusion, or do you want to have it in 30 minutes? Because if you want to answer in 30 minutes, like mathematically, your margin of error is very high. The more you sit on it, you can trim down your margin of error, which means your level of accuracy increases over time. So this is what it means when we say critical thinking. Be aware of your circumstances. Be aware of the party who's saying something to you. Be careful about your own emotional state when you're listening to news, because your emotional state can also impact how you interpret news, even if it's the exact same set of facts put in front of you. And be aware of the social incentives that are around you. As an example, if you're with a group of people who go to church, you will tend to interpret the facts in a certain way. If you're out with your colleagues and you hear the same level of information, what you vocalize is a little different. If you are self-reflective, you will see that. And the reason is because we always have a social need to fit within a community, a tribe. So just be aware of it. I'm not saying this doesn't mean that the more you're aware of it, the more it increases your EQ levels, your your intelligence in terms of critical thinking and understanding, and the better you become at dissecting, not making quick decisions, being patient, looking at multiple sources to come to an educated conclusion that is actually based on facts and reality.
Yeah, and one thing that we've talked about personally when it comes to critical thinking is our school's actually doing a good job of teaching critical thinking anymore. There's been a real decline in emphasis, and the data is, really concerning. There's a survey by a group called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They show teachers stressing deductive reasoning has dropped sharply from 86% in fourth grade to just 39% in eighth grade. By high school and college, it's even worse. A Reboot Foundation survey, another type of survey, found only 55% of adults say their critical thinking improved since high school. Nearly a quarter say it deteriorated. Even in college, there's meta-analyses and research studies that shows many students gain zero in complex reasoning skills over 4 years. And there's reasons for this. Our education really prioritizes facts. We prioritize standardized tests over explicit critical thinking instead of skills where we're questioning assumptions, spotting biases, really evaluating evidence. And barriers to this, we're not blaming teachers or schools per se, but barriers to this include time pressure. Many teachers and administrators are forced to administer standardized tests in March or April or May. And so you're squeezing in your whole curriculum. There's also a gap in teacher training. Are we actually encouraging teachers to teach critical thinking? There's a cultural shift toward quick answers. If TikTok can't answer it in 30 seconds, you're probably not going to get a good answer, sadly, right? And so that's just the reality of where critical thinking is in our society. But to touch on something you said, talk about this idea of group harmony, right? I mean, we've talked about cognitive dissonance, which is your one internal psychological process of how you reject new information. But as a group, there are psychological processes where you desire harmony. And groupthink is one of those ideas coined by a guy named Irvin Janis. It's this desire for harmony in a group, which often overrides critical thinking. And so in a group, dissent gets suppressed, alternatives are ignored. In politics, this is really deadly. Your party, your social group, your online feed becomes the in group, and questioning it really feels like betrayal. If you've ever been part of a group that's, I don't know, overly like Republican or Democrat or, I don't know, pro business or any other type of group, you question the fundamentals of that group, and because you get shot at pretty quickly, like, um, verbally assaulted. You get a lot of interesting comments thrown at you because the groupthink is being challenged, right? It's this us versus them mentality, which your brain has compartmentalized and we unknowingly sometimes fall into. But another aspect of this is really personal experience, right? And this is our last question that we're going to think through. Does personal experience really shape our facts? Believe it or not, you might think you're smart, you might think you're intellectual and well read, maybe you have a master's or a PhD. Guess what? All the research shows that our decision making is driven much more by our intuition and our emotions than actual concrete facts. Kind of scary when you think about it, right? You've almost kind of lost control of your head here. But it's what the research shows. Personal experiences are the lens through which we see everything, and they distort as much as they inform. This is motivated reasoning and really a confirmation bias in action. We seek, we remember, we interpret information that fits our lived reality while downplaying what doesn't. And so the way you grow up, the economic status of how you lived in your 20s or maybe your teens or a critical moment of despair, these things really shape our decisions in the future, especially our political views. For example, if you grew up in a struggling town in the Rust Belt, economic facts might feel like, the elites are ignoring us, even if data shows that there are trends where people are trying to help the Rust Belt. Personal stories of job loss or maybe crime, that becomes your political North Star. Valid emotionally, but can often obscure real systematic data. And studies show that people literally misremember facts to align with their side. So think about that. People literally distort facts, misremember ideas simply to align with their position that was often shaped by a personal experience. And so, we create these alternative facts. There's red facts, there's blue facts. These experiences often feel true, than actual stats. And so we kind of cherry pick without even knowing it. So sharing personal stories of harm can bridge divide by building empathy. So, sharing life experiences can actually help another person really understand where you're coming from in forming a belief.
Yeah, very, very true. And one of the interesting things, like when I think about, so like, when you were talking about groupthink, I was thinking about this thing where at work, at the workplace, and this is very common, like we have meetings with groups. And after that meeting, like even when I'm a manager, I go and talk individually with different people and I hear different things. There are things that they will not say in a group in the meeting, but they will say that when it's one on one just with me. It's the same thing whether you're at home and you're lecturing your kids, that's one state. But then when you pull them aside and talk to them individually, you get a more nuanced story of what exactly happened and why they did, what they were thinking, which they may or may not expose when you talk to them broadly. So if you just think through your own life experiences, whether at work or at home, you can start understanding and seeing this in real life. It's just an interesting part of how people operate, how we behave in social networks, what our incentives are when we are in a group or when we are alone. Think about how strong we are when we are voicing our opposition in public versus in private. So it's very just as you think through yourself and become more self-aware, you can see how all of these different points that we were making in this podcast start interacting, and you see how it all starts making sense.
Yeah, a book I'd really recommend. It's by an author named Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. It's a book called The Righteous Mind. And the idea is he's talking about how good people can come to very different conclusions based on the exact same set of facts. And his argument is that human morality and decision making is driven, as we said, far more by intuition and emotion than by deliberate reasoning. And that people usually reason after the fact to justify their moral judgments. And so there's research behind this, is what we're saying. You can go look this up. You can read this book. You can check out the larger body of what people have studied. And so we're much more emotional and subjective than we want to believe. And so even if you think you're smart and cerebral and intellectual and you process everything well and you understand both sides, chances are there's an element of subjectivity and emotion that is injected into every decision. I gave this example before. Imagine a race of purple people. Right? Picking purple not to offend anyone here, but imagine that one purple person did something horrible to you when you were a kid. You grow up, and even if 99.9% of purple people are amazing, that one experience is going to make you scared, paranoid, angry. It's going to be hard for you to accept purple people because of that one horrible experience. Now play that into different situations, right? That you see on the news. That purple person could be someone that was maybe rich, maybe someone that was poor. That purple person could be something that was maybe someone from another country, maybe your neighbor, right? And so the idea is these experiences drastically alter and affect our perceptions of the world. And so, we hope you listen to this and it helps you become more compassionate person. It's sad to see and hear stories of people that have been friends for decades ripped apart because of the news or a political position, right? And so encourage you to listen to this podcast, think through some of the points, ask yourself, am I able to understand another person's position through a lens of humility and understanding and really recognizing that their shared experience of however they grew up is affecting their position. Any closing thoughts here?
Yep. So there is a saying that we have heard: facts don't care about your feelings, right? It's a common saying. But the truth is, feelings end up actually being the filter for your facts. And so you cannot separate it. There's nobody in the world who is quote unquote unbiased, like this very high standard we have set. It doesn't exist. People strive to be as neutral as possible and as unbiased as possible. What it requires is because like I said earlier, there are studies that show that highly intelligent people are actually better at being polarized because they use their superior cognitive and reasoning skills to do something what is called motivated reasoning, meaning they find more complex and sophisticated ways to justify what they already believe. So they hunker down. So what do we need? We need people to use their critical thinking skills. And while you do it, be aware that you want to be intellectually honest. And for being intellectually honest, you have to be humble to understand that there may be things that I know that I think of is as fact that may not be the fact. And I'm willing to change if it's not true. If you are seeking for the truth, you will find the truth. That's the only way you can find the truth, if you seek for it. And let the facts and the evidence lead you to a point of the truth. If you're preconceived in your notions, it's going to get you to wherever you want to go. And that's fine if that's what you want. But you have to at least not fool yourself that you're being neutral and honest and unbiased, right? There is no problem in having a set ideology. And there are people who say that, listen, I know what I am. I'm not unbiased, right? This is my bias and I know it. That's great. At least they're honest about it. The people that I'm most worried and scared about is the ones who think they are unbiased, but they're actually being biased, and it's a little deceptive, right? They're not being able to be intellectually honest to themselves and make sure that they are on a path that helps them to get to the actual truth that they're seeking.
Yeah, that's really eye-opening. And the good news is the divide, the polarization isn't inevitable. Awareness is step number one. And so we encourage you, listen to our podcast, tune in again for another episode of The Balanced Lens. But we encourage you, drop a comment. What resonated most with you during this episode? Encourage you to subscribe more for more updates from The Balanced Lens. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.